Fox News Alert as we await remarks from Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, who is set to address the Homeland Security Advisory Council at the bottom of the hour. His comments coming just days after the Ohio State University campus attack where the Somali-born suspect was shot dead, but not before he injured 11 people. We're also now just learning about a trip he made to our nation's capital ahead of the attack. Our chief intelligence correspondent, Catherine Harris, is following all these developments for us now from Washington, D.C. Catherine.
Well, thank you, Jenna. A law enforcement source confirms to Fox News that the Ohio State suspect, Abdul Razak Ali Artan, traveled to the Washington area late last week before the shooting, and this is now a central focus of the FBI investigation that's looking at the motivation for Monday's attack. The source said Artan arrived late on November 24th, Thanksgiving Day, and then left on the 25th with a trip short duration, suggesting it was, quote, purposeful. FBI agents are now seeking the necessary authorities from the court to get records from his phone service provider that will help nail down where he went in D.C. and whether he contacted anyone. There is also separate reporting by NBC News that Artan bought a knife at Home Depot on the Washington trip. And that fact may be significant because at yesterday's news conference in Ohio, reporters were told Artan purchased a knife at Walmart Monday morning, and investigators are working to verify what knife was actually used in that attack. Meantime, the Republican chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, who's getting briefings on what happened at Ohio State, said investigators are also focused on his time in Pakistan before he entered the U.S. with his family as a minor.
I think we want to know more about him and what happened to him. Was he potentially radicalized before he came in? I know the family is now being interviewed by the FBI to see what contacts he had in Pakistan.
This is now the fourth major case inside the U.S. where the suspect was a follower of al-Qaeda and also ISIS propaganda, and the emerging pattern is that the teachings from the American cleric al-Awlaki, who was killed by the CIA in a drone strike 5 years ago, is really like a stepping stone to the Islamic State material. And we can expect the Secretary of Homeland Security, Jay Johnson, will get questions about this very topic in about 20 minutes, Jenna.
Watching for headlines from that. Catherine, thank you.
Neighbors say they knew it was coming when they noticed increased railroad activity at Fort Carson this weekend, and now it's official.
4,000 troops from the 3rd Armored Brigade Combat Team are heading for Europe. KRDO News Channel 13's Scott Harrison spoke with an Army veteran who shared his opinion on what to expect.
Fort Carson leadership has yet to say when the 3rd Armored Brigade Combat Team will deploy to Europe, exactly how long it will be gone, and where in Europe it's going. But word spread quickly throughout the Mountain Post community on Friday. We spoke with an Army veteran who once served at Fort Carson and was deployed many times. He supports this deployment, and he tells us what he thinks will happen overseas.
Europe's a very hot spot right now. Financial, political instability, a lot of the Syrian refugees, a lot of the radicalized Muslims throughout Europe. It's just, it's a tinderbox right now, and people don't see that. They're more focused on the presidential election.
The timing of the unit's deployment isn't the best for families, friends, and loved ones of the soldiers involved, because it will likely happen either just before or during the holiday season. The best we can hope for is that the unit's mission is successful and all of the members make it home safely. At Fort Carson, Scott Harrison, KRDO News Channel 13.
We did learn a few more details just minutes ago from Army headquarters. The 3rd Armored Brigade Combat Team is scheduled to deploy in January. They will head to Poland. The unit will be gone for approximately 9 months.
It's a first in Russian history. Moscow announced the deployment of an S-300 anti-aircraft missile system, seen here for the first time on foreign territory. The long-range surface-to-air weapon will be installed at a naval facility in Tartus, in the northwest of Syria. An announcement that's made Washington nervous.
It's not clear why the placement of S-300s in Syria has caused such a stir among our Western colleagues. I remind you that the S-300 is purely defensive system and poses no threat to anyone.
The S-300 system in Tartus will reinforce Russia's defense on Syria's coast. It already has an S-400 long-range missile system in place at the Hmeimim Air Base just north. The S-300 announcement comes a day after the U.S. halted talks with Russia on military cooperation in Syria. Washington has grown increasingly critical of Russia's actions since the failure of a fragile ceasefire brokered by the two countries. In Brussels on Monday, Secretary of State John Kerry blamed Moscow for the failure.
We will continue, as we have before, to pursue a meaningful, sustainable, and forcible cessation of hostilities throughout the country. Russia knows exactly what it needs to do in order to get that cessation implemented in a fair and reasonable way.
Russia has been accused of indiscriminately bombing Aleppo's rebel-held east, as it joins the regime in an offensive to regain control of Syria's second city.
Russia has voiced an objection to Ukraine's plans to carry out missile firing exercise over Crimea next week. The Russian Defense Ministry presented the Ukrainian military attaché with a note of protest over the issue. Now, Moscow says that the airspace of the planned launches violates territorial seas of the Russian Federation. Russia's Federal Air Transport Agency also slammed the, quote, unilateral decision by Kiev to conduct these drills.
Rosaviatia has already sent its request to the aviation authorities so that they immediately remove all the bans and revoke their decision. Rosaviatia believes the attempts to activate restricted zones are inadmissible, especially in order to conduct military exercises on the territory of another state. And we remind the Ukrainian side that all such actions must be agreed with the Russian Federation, at least regarding the open space above the sea.
Now, Rosaviatia also said that the missiles will be fired in regions where civil and state aviation flights run. The agency added that it's now working with Ukrainian officials to reverse their decision before the start of the drills come December 1st. Meanwhile, Ukraine has responded to the protest, saying that it is free to conduct military maneuvers anywhere in, quote, its airspace, including Crimea. Now, Crimea decided in a referendum back in March of 2014 to return to the Russian Federation.
Mosul is back in the headlines, so here's a quick primer in case you haven't been paying attention. Mosul is a city of at least 1.5 million people in northern Iraq, and it's ISIS's last major stronghold in the country. 2 years ago, the terrorist group captured Mosul essentially uncontested.
This is a nightmare scenario that U.S. generals, when they were here in Iraq, never talked about.
The Iraqi army charged with protecting the city withered. Its soldiers dropped their guns and shed their uniforms. As ISIS militants flooded over the border from Syria, many Iraqi soldiers simply fled.
What surprised us, certainly from a military perspective, was how quickly they moved into Mosul over the summer, how fast that went, their progress up north, as well as just the way 4 or 5 Iraqi divisions kind of melted away.
It was a strategic and symbolic defeat, both for Iraq's government and for the United States, which had spent billions of dollars training the Iraqi army and had withdrawn its own troops some 2.5 years earlier.
The U.S. fought a nearly decade-long war, costing thousands of American lives and $1 trillion, for this not to happen.
Now, the Iraqi army, backed by a U.S.-led coalition, is preparing an offensive to take the city back, and ISIS is buckling down for a fight. According to American and Iraqi officials, ISIS has set booby traps, lowering explosives into holes dug throughout the city, built tunnels so that militants can quickly disappear from one location only to pop back up firing from another, and have rigged the city's bridges with bombs. Experts worry about the devastating death toll the attack could have on Mosul's civilians. By night, ISIS militants with night vision goggles sit on rooftops at the city's edge, watching for anyone trying to escape. And then there's this concern. What happens if the offensive works? The anti-ISIS coalition is a motley collection of Iran-backed Shiite militias, Turkish troops, Kurds, Assyrian Christians, Yazidis, and others. They all have competing interests. And in fact, one reason ISIS was able to take Mosul so easily 2 years ago was that many of the city's Sunni-majority population felt betrayed and even persecuted by Iraq's Shiite-led government. So, if ISIS is pushed out, who will fill the power vacuum? Will sectarian tensions in the anti-ISIS coalition flare up? These types of questions have been asked before, still with no clear answers.
Hey NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.
It's the eve of Sukkot, and this Jewish community in North London is preparing for 7 days and 7 nights of festivities. but the streets are shared with a noticeable police presence. And a report released today might help explain why. Hate crimes against Jews have increased by nearly a third since 2010, according to the Home Affairs Select Committee report. And the volume and viciousness of online abuse is unprecedented. It's all news that comes as no surprise to the community.
We will get calls from visibly Jewish people, whether it's in London, North Manchester, Gateshead, Leeds, other places, who tell us that on a regular basis when they walk to and from synagogue, they get abuse shouted at them by people on street corners, by people from passing cars. They may get stones or coins thrown at them. And for too many people, this is something they feel they have to put up with because it's just part of being Jewish.
The report shows an 11% rise in anti-Semitic incidents in the first half of this year compared to 2015. It also shows the number of people in Britain with anti-Semitic attitudes rose by 50% in just 12 months. And as many as 1 in 20 adults in the UK could now be characterised as clearly anti-Semitic. Daniel and Theo are barely in their teens, children who say they've had vicious hate shouted at them by grown men.
We were getting onto a bus and a car was driving by, and seeing as we were wearing our suits and our kippah on our head, the car slowed down and shouted, "You Jewish."
I was just thinking, why do they feel that way just because we're Jewish? I just felt it was unfair, and I just hadn't experienced anything like this before.
As bleak a picture as this report paints of anti-Semitism across the whole of the UK, some of the most critical lines are reserved for the Labour Party, saying there is, quote, safe space for people with vile attitudes towards the Jewish people. It also goes on to say that on this issue, Jeremy Corbyn has shown, quote, a lack of consistent leadership. It's of a different order to criminal hate speech, but the report cites cases like Naz Shah, who was suspended by the Labour Party for anti-Semitic Facebook posts before being elected to Parliament, and Ken Livingstone, who defended her before making further inflammatory comments. He was suspended too, but Ms Shah was allowed back into the party less than 3 months later.
Every political party has a problem and can and needs to do much better on tackling anti-Semitism. But let's not beat around the bush. The Labour Party has a particular problem with anti-Semitic incidents at the moment over the last year, and that's under Jeremy Corbyn's watch, I'm afraid.
Jeremy Corbyn today has criticised the report for unfairly focusing on Labour. He also said that under his leadership, Labour has taken greater action against anti-Semitism than any other party.
Welcome back to Hardball. We're back with the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. His new book is called Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. And President Carter, why did you use the word apartheid in the book's title?
Well, let's look at the entire title, if you don't mind. The first word is Palestine, which involves the land that belongs to the Palestinians, not the Israelis. I didn't refer to Israel because there's no semblance of anything relating to apartheid within the nation of Israel. And I also emphasized the word not, that is peace and not apartheid. That's what I hope to accomplish with this book, is to move toward that goal. But there's no doubt that within the occupied territories, Palestinian land, that there is a horrendous example of apartheid. The occupation of Palestinian land, the confiscation of that land that doesn't belong to Israel, the building of settlements on it, the colonization of that land, and then the connection of those isolated but multiple settlements, more than 200 of them, with each other by highways on which Palestinians can't travel, and quite often where Palestinians cannot even cross. So the persecution of the Palestinians now under the occupying territories, is under the occupation forces, is one of the worst examples of human rights deprivation that I know. And I think
even worse, though, than a place like Rwanda?
Yes, I think, yes. You mean now?
Yes.
I think
the impression now of the Israelis, of the Palestinians by the Israelis, is worse than a situation in Africa like the oppression of Rwandans and the Civil War.
I'm not going back into ancient history about Rwanda, but right now, the persecution of the Palestinians is one of the worst examples of human rights abuse I know, because the Palestinians...
You're talking about right now. You're not talking about, say,
I'm not talking about ancient history. No.
Well, Rwanda wasn't ancient history. It was just a few years ago.
You can talk about Rwanda if you want to. I want to talk about Palestine. What is being done to the Palestinians now is horrendous in their own territory by the occupying powers, which is Israel. They've taken away all the basic human rights of the Palestinians, as was done in South Africa against the blacks. And I make it very plain in this book that the apartheid is not based on racism, as it was in South Africa, but it's based on the desire of a minority of Israelis to acquire land that belongs to the Palestinians and to...
A drastic change just this week from extreme to even worse, if that's possible, as California suffers through an unprecedented drought that we've been covering over half the state, now facing the most severe conditions. One of the hardest hit areas is Lake Piru in California. NBC's Joe Fryer is there for us tonight. Joe, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. Hard to believe this is Lake Piru. We're actually standing at the boat launch. Clearly no boats going in the water. In fact, you can't even see water from where we're standing. Lake levels here are at 25% of what's considered normal, all thanks to a drought that's causing some to take drastic measures. On a parched citrus farm in Central California, it has come to this. A bulldozer is ripping out a third of Sean Stevenson's orange trees. There's just not enough water to keep everything alive.
When these trees are gone, they're not going to use any more water, so I can put that water on another crop.
Already, he has laid off some of his staff, a fourth-generation farm facing a once-in-a-lifetime drought.
An unprecedented fourth season without rains has left huge swatches of land in eastern Ethiopia bone dry and millions of people starving. Much of their livestock, which they depend on, has been wiped out. In some areas, people have lost up to 90% of their animals. Omar is one of those counting his losses. He tells me he had hundreds of cows, goats and camels, but they are now all dead and he fears for his future. At the only health clinic in this area, hundreds of people have come to get medical attention. Some, like Harid Sugie, have walked for days to get here. 3 of his 10 children are severely malnourished and need urgent treatment. Across the affected areas, malnutrition rates have increased dramatically. Save the Children says at least 6 million children are now facing critical food shortages in Ethiopia. Thousands of people depend entirely on food aid. The international community and the Ethiopian government have stepped up relief efforts, but it's not coming in quick enough.
We continue our assistance in the whole Africa, in particular the affected regions by El Nino, by climate change, as long as it takes. And this is why we call on other donors to increase their assistance in order to meet the needs on the ground.
The drought has triggered memories of the famine in 1984, in which nearly 1 million people died. But the government says it is in a much better shape to help its people. Yet it needs much more help to avert a looming disaster. Emmanuel Legunza, BBC News, Eastern Ethiopia.
Good evening. Just ahead of the spring and summer travel season, we got a sobering update on Zika today. The nation's top health officials warning that the Zika virus appears to be a lot scarier than first thought, spreading much faster. And the United States will soon be in the crosshairs, with the mosquito population taking off in the coming warmer months. The National Institutes of Health and the CDC issuing an urgent plea to Congress today to act now to pay for immediate steps to protect Americans. NBC's Tom Costello has details.
Tonight, a stark warning that the haunting images of babies born with microcephaly in Brazil, abnormally small heads and brains, are becoming a very real concern in the U.S.
Everything we look at with this virus seems to be a bit scarier than we initially thought.
The Zika virus is carried by the Aedes aegypti mosquito. Until recently, researchers believed it was found in just 12 states. The new estimate, 30. Further north than first thought, though that doesn't mean they'll carry Zika that far. Already, 346 Zika cases are reported all over the country, mostly from travelers who brought the virus home. And now pregnant women living along the Gulf Coast are potentially at risk. Tropical disease expert Dr. Peter Hotez is warning microcephaly could ravage the region like Hurricane Katrina.
I'm very worried that in the areas of extreme poverty, in poor neighborhoods, in U.S. Gulf Coast cities such as Houston and New Orleans, maybe Tampa, that we are highly vulnerable to seeing Zika virus transmission leading to microcephaly cases.
Especially vulnerable, the poor living without air conditioning or window screens near standing water where mosquitoes thrive. Researchers also say unborn babies may be at risk throughout the mother's pregnancy, not just in the first trimester. And Zika can cause other forms of brain damage, damage that may show up years later.
The more and more we learn, the more and more you get concerned about the scope of what this virus is doing.
Tonight, the CDC and the NIH are both urging Congress to provide nearly $2 billion to fight Zika. So far, though, Republican leaders have insisted the White House use money allocated for Ebola prevention first. Now, with temperatures rising and cities already spraying for mosquitoes, health experts warn they need to emergency funding now.